Let's see, it's preparing to live stream, so we'll see, and I will see it go live on my other window. Maybe. Yep, here we go. Okay, so we are live to live stream, so oops, we'll see, and I will see it go live. That's always fun to hear yourself talking.
That was interesting.
Recording. That was interesting. Okay, so we are here for Shakespeare on Stage to talk about Love's Labour's Lost, which, as Nicole pointed out in her intro, is one of the many variations of the title. So maybe that's something we can talk about. Last week, Suki mentioned when we were talking about Timon that sometimes Shakespeare's titles don't seem to make sense. And so this is one of the ones that she was talking about. So it'll be interesting to talk about the title and how it might make sense, and see what else other people have to talk about. Nicole, you brought up a lot of interesting points in your intro video. So we'll...
Yeah, I figure we can talk about gender issues with the mouse, right? We can get into that. We're one man against three women.
I don't see it as a competition, so I'm not a very good sparring partner.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we have Carla and Lane from Lark.
Yeah.
Blank. It's been a long Monday. So from Lark Productions, so we're excited to have you here and have your perspective as folks who put on Shakespeare plays. And you guys, have you all done this one, Love's Labour's Lost?
We have not done Love's Labour's Lost. It was under discussion a few years ago, but we just, we kind of roll with what we feel like our audience wants to do and our actors want to do. So we haven't done it yet, but that's not saying we won't.
Okay.
Lane and I were lucky enough to see a production of it a while back and really enjoyed it. So we would love to discuss some of it.
Yeah, we got to see the RSC production in London.
Oh, how fun.
Shakespeare Company, because they were doing a paired production, Love's Labour's Lost and Much Ado About Nothing. Mm-hmm. Same cast in flip shows and in the same time period. They were very connected.
Super interesting because they complement each other so well. I was watching this production, the Stratford production, and going, it's just Much Ado. It's
without the happy ending.
Baron he's just like Benedict, and they say a lot of the same things. So it was fun to see them back to back. Actually, we got to London and I thought I was buying tickets to Love's Labour's Lost, and then I looked at my tickets and went, oh, I just bought tickets for Much Ado, the one that I have done. And so we actually got to see, we spent the extra money and saw both of them, which was really, it was a fun pairing just to watch how the company did both back to back with the same actors, but completely different scripts. So that was fun.
But Love's Labour, I had never seen before that performance. And I really appreciated, Nicole, your views on, kind of the research you did around gender and that kind of thing. A lot of it, what we found watching it and the study that we've done on it is that it has some just beautifully strong women's roles, and a bunch of them, right? Yes. A lot of Shakespeare plays have 2 women,
right.
and 35 men. And this is one of the exceptions, and gives you a lot to play with around the interaction between major and minor characters, men and women. So it's a fun show.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, we'll have to look at it, because that's what we find having a Shakespeare company is you can never find enough men. And a lot of times you just have to, translate roles, and, as Shakespeare had them all played by men, sometimes we played the male roles by women.
Young boys played the women, correct?
Sometimes you just have to do that. But it's nice to come across one that has so many really, really good women's roles, really smart women, really And I was enjoying listening to the cast, some of the cast members talk about their experience with it. And the actresses were saying they just enjoyed how much agency the characters had, how they were able to determine their own fate at the end of the play, which
Right.
doesn't always happen in Elizabethan drama in general, and in Shakespeare quite a lot. So
Right.
it was fun to just hear the actress's point of view as they were approaching those roles. So
It's interesting to think how the play might have been written differently if in Shakespeare's day they had actually both men and women
on
acting. I
stage,
wonder
yeah.
wonder if he would have included more female roles. I assume the reason they did that, I've always heard that all the roles were played by men, and boys too were
Mhm.
playing the women's roles. Does anybody know why? Was that because it was just considered improper for a woman to be in the theater?
Yeah, I think in Britain specifically, it was considered improper because in the same time period they had female actresses in France and on the stages
Mhm.
in other parts of Europe, but not in Britain. It was just not
Was not done.
wasn't done.
I think it was illegal.
Yeah.
What I remember studying, I think it was illegal for women to act until
Yeah, that's never stopped people though, you know.
Sometimes you wonder.
Yeah, you know, and you do wonder because some of the roles are such great, strong women. Sometimes you wonder if there was a kind of don't ask, don't tell policy on some of this stuff.
Yeah, who knows? You know,
You really don't know. You know what the rules were because they get written down, but you don't know how it's interpreted
Yeah.
and enforced because that was never written down.
Yeah, there may have been some women who were actors who pretended to be little boys playing roles or something. Who knows?
Yeah.
Like Shakespeare in Love. Yeah.
Of course,
Yeah.
there's the whole debate about whether Shakespeare was actually a man and Shakespeare was actually Shakespeare or somebody else. So there's that whole thing.
Yeah, but for the play, for Love's Labor's Lost, I mean, you were talking about the title, Karen, a little bit earlier. I found it completely rational because it's about the labor associated from the men's point of view of winning the love of the women. It's lost, right? They put in their minds, they're putting a whole bunch of effort forward and they're forswearing themselves. They're sacrificing their reputations again in their own mind, though they arguably didn't have that much reputation to sacrifice in the first place. But they, you know, they're putting all this effort towards something that then comes to naught at the end.
Right. And I think clearly the apostrophe S, it's a possessive and then a contraction, right? So it's loves, possessive, labor is lost. And that's kind of their philosophy in the beginning. And it's how it turns out when they actually end up falling in love. So love's labor is lost.
It's so punny and so many double meanings, just like pretty much every word of the dialogue in the play.
In
like
this
there's
play,
so many levels that you can understand it on, that the title itself is like, how did he mean this? And it's there's double meanings, there's triple meanings, there's puns, and unbelievable language in this play.
Yes, there is.
It's
almost a nightmare if you don't like puns. It's like one of those friends that won't stop punning. Have you had one of those friends before? They just won't stop.
Yeah.
Please stop.
So I watched the play and then I went over and I kind of watched the actors talk about their experience, and it wasn't all the actors, it was a handful of the actors. But they were talking about like just how do you unpack all that language and how do you even get not just your brain around it, but your mouth around it when it comes to playing it for a modern audience and just sharing that, you know. And one of the actors was saying the first day the director told them, we are in an auditorium, and auditorium, the root is to hear. So it's about hearing the words first, and then we'll add all the, you know, bells and whistles and activity and costumes and pretty stuff, you know. And And that's true. In the time of Shakespeare, they talked about going to hear a play.
Mm-hmm.
You went to hear it. You didn't go to watch it
necessarily.
And I've had the experience of being able to stand backstage and listen
Mm-hmm.
when we perform, and it's radio theater. Lane and I say to each other all the time, like, this is radio theater, because he wrote it primarily for the sounds and for the hearer to be heard. So, and this one is just,
yes.
it's
Although
kind
I
of,
think there's something in the modern age to reading the plays as well. Yeah. I think because of our distance from the language, it's very, very difficult to just hear and get all those layers.
mm-hmm.
So if you spend like twice as much time as the play takes to perform, right, you can look at all those footnotes and really get all the levels of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Nicole, I had it pulled up. I had the Folgers text pulled up and I was reading it as I was watching it.
I think that's pretty good.
I felt like I didn't have time to do both things and build on top. And that helped me to see, but it was interesting because there were a lot of lines that were skipped. Mm-hmm. So I kept having to say, oh no, where am I now? Because they skipped whole chunks of the text.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right.
And so then I'm wondering, okay, was it deliberate, or did the actor forget, and just ahead of the lines? Like, what?
I would imagine it's deliberate with that caliber of actor. I don't think it would be
right. Yeah. Although with a live, with that, you're filming it, and so you never know.
Maybe something went wrong. We cut it out.
Yeah, something. I don't know. So it was interesting. But I was thinking about that with all the Latin words. Mm-hmm. Back in Shakespeare's day, most people would have known what the words meant.
Well, educated people would have.
Yes.
It was the language of the educational sphere.
Right.
That's how they communicated in Europe on scholarly terms. They put everything into Latin.
Yes. And the church as well. The church, they would have heard all their
right, that too. Yes.
Yeah.
So there was more familiarity with it then, anyways, than now. I took a year of Latin. I had no idea what I was reading.
I actually had to. I went to at the junior high level, I went to a private Christian school, and they made you learn Latin. They were old fashioned. So
I just went to
I took Latin too.
Yeah.
I went to a school in Backwoods, Tennessee, and that was the only foreign language they had was Latin. So
I think it actually is good.
It was really good.
Study it a little bit, at least, because there's so much that we've taken from the Latin language.
Yeah, but I was thinking about that with what you guys were saying about all of the language in the play for a modern audience. A lot of that Latin would just go
over
everybody's heads. And so it's interesting to see that they kept it in there knowing that, and it kind of adds to that perception of those characters as, using words they don't mean, and that kind of that elevated language it kind of adds to that effect, that pompousness, kind of coming across.
Right. Yeah. And it shows you who Shakespeare's audience was. Who he wanted to please and who he wanted to be his patrons, because he was a commercial artist. Let's be real. he had to write in something that was pleasing enough that somebody would pay him for it. Right. When it came to his plays, he had to be commercial. And so it gives you an idea of who his audience was. Because we talk about the groundlings at the Globe and how this scene was there for them, all the blood, just to get them all excited about it or whatever. But the truth is, this play, with all of the high language and all of those beautiful rhymes and all of that the court activity, right? It was very clearly for a particular audience. This was not for the groundlings who were coming in just to see some action, get to see how he did the special effect of cutting the guy's head off, right? This was not that play. And so from what we read, it was early in his career, right? Very early is what scholars say. And you wonder how much of that was just him learning to play with language the way he he did so beautifully throughout all of his writings, right? Is this an early kind of overdone attempt at that? Because he just went so far with this particular show of all of the puns and all of the beautiful florid language. You just go, wow. I mean, how much can you cram into one show? Because he did it all. You know, he had no restraint. And that seems like an indication of a young playwright, right?
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting. I was just going to say, it's kind of interesting too that he toned it down as he went from then on. So he kind of came into his own here, where it had all of those elements that we're used to in Shakespeare, but it almost seems like too much, right? But I'm wondering if he was hearing from people, oh, you're just going over the top or something. Maybe that's why he toned it down after a while.
I think there were challenges certainly in the period in the theater world in London, because there was this idea of it was a fairly new idea of you have to have your play take place in the time period that your play can take place, and that's kind of what he did with The Tempest. And probably there were challenges among the theatrical people to, how much poetry can you put in, or how much, there were just these ideas that people were trying, and then Marlowe would write something and then Shakespeare would write something. It's a little contest somewhat. But as for what Lane was saying about kind of really over the top, and I think there was a purpose behind it, because his whole story in Love's Labor's Lost is about people going over the top. In the very first scene, like, he states his thesis very, very clearly right at the beginning. In the first few lines, the guys are signing this contract that says they're going to sleep 3 hours a night and study the rest of the hours for 3 years, and they're not going to see women, and they're not going to eat more than one meal a day, and then they're going to fast 3 days. It's absurd, the contract that they're signing, which Barone makes really evident right. He's like, I hope that's not in there, but it's all in there. And so the absurdity, that just taking it so far, he's kind of making a joke of all the highfalutin language, and he's making a joke with the language the guys use, because he's just saying, you're just taking your philosophy to this level that's completely untenable.
And they're French, so.
And he's doing it with the language too. He's going like, how far can we take the language of this play before it becomes just
absurd?
And one of the actors that I was listening to said it was this push and pull. The whole play is this push and pull between the absurd and the intellectual. And it's like, there's intellectual, which is good, and then there's taking everything to this absurdist level where it has no meaning anymore.
Right.
And if you say any woman who comes within a mile of the castle is going to have her tongue cut out, that's a terrible thought. And it's right there in the very first scene, and they kind of gloss over it. It's a terrible thing to say. It's a terrible part of the contract. And of course they don't, but they break the contract immediately. Everything in the contract gets broken. The only thing is they should always be eating. As a director, I would be like, you always have to be eating, because part of the contract was that you would like be on these really restricted diets. And so I felt like, as a director, you should make sure that there's food kind of in every scene, just to show that they're breaking that part of the contract too.
Yeah, it's probably a good idea.
And somebody should be taking a nap.
I was just going to say,
or just nodding off.
That would be awesome.
That's what would happen if you only slept 3 hours a night. You'd be going like this while you're studying the whole time.
Right after lunch, out.
So they'd be studying all right, but it would be like this.
Right? You've seen it. Students don't stay awake all the time.
That is right.
Yeah.
Any other questions for us, Karen?
Well, I think that was the language one. We could delve into the views of the female.
Yeah.
That would be fun. Should we do that? Okay, so Nicole, you were talking about, and I forget what it was called, some men's rights thing.
Men going
What was
their
that
own
that you were
way.
talking about in your intro video?
Yeah, that's a internet thing now. It's shockingly big and it's shockingly horrible.
I mean, it sounds like it.
It's really awful, actually. And there's a lot of men into it. And essentially, it's not quite for the same reasons that are stated here, but they're men that have sworn themselves off women. But most of them, it's because they're undateable anyway. So, but they're not even going to try. So, and they just sit in this forum all day long and bash on women and talk about why women are to blame for all the problems of the Western world and how they destroy men's lives and steal their energy and all these things. So the reality is those people are wasting their time doing that, but they blame women for their lives. So it's a pretty bad scene.
Yeah.
It's related to the whole alt-right, men's rights movement. So
it's interesting that you connected that to the beginning of the play where the guys are swearing off of women and food and all these other things.
Right.
So that in some way they're supposed to think better, right? That was the whole purpose in the play was
that kind of thinking is very prevalent on the MGTOW boards. We know that, they just jumble your brain, they make you emotional, and you'll be this perfect rational being if only you can get women completely out of your life.
It's so interesting that Shakespeare equates food, sleep, women in that contract.
All the bodily stuff.
All the things that you really have to have.
Right.
That you really have to have.
Yeah, it's divorcing head from body is essentially what's going on there.
Yeah, they might as well.
It's saying somehow you can just be a brain, right? Forget about your body, which that's not balanced thinking, of course.
And that's stated later in the play. I mean, just peripherally when they come in, I can't remember the character's name, comes in to meet the Queen of France and says, which is the head lady? And she says, well, you can judge by the fact that none of the other ladies have heads. And so there's a line in the play that just talks about really?
Right.
And it's one of those ridiculous puns and plays on words, but it's, you find those things when you look at the dialogue and go, it's like these guys are trying to divorce all their bodily functions from their brains, and then the queen has a line about what good, how are you going to tell?
It's true of human nature too. As soon as you make something illegal, and make it banned, then the desire for it is somehow emphasized. Just try going on a diet for a day. You'll want every kind of food on the planet, right? So it's the same thing here.
Yeah.
Well, and I thought it was interesting, this scene where all of the guys come in with their love letters and they're all making fun of each other for how absurd they are. And this is what they come up with after following this protocol. It kind of pokes fun at it right inside the play that they really are not that much smarter. Their heads are kind of they're not doing a very good job. And then they come up with this insane, let's dress up like Russians and pretend that we're some other people. And so it's kind of funny because it's so crazy, the things that they come up with, that it just shows right in the play how silly it is that they thought smarter by doing these things.
To me, I thought all of the scholarly people were fools ultimately. I mean, there was no scholar there that was just a great scholar. I mean, they took the thinking, as you said, always to the extreme where it, the mind takes you to a place, the rational mind takes you to a place that's insane, ironically, right? If you follow the rational thought far enough, you get to
Yeah.
a very insane place.
What you were talking about balance.
Yeah, I think that that's a really good point, Nicole. And the more that I work with Shakespeare, the more every play is about that
Mhm.
balance. That was what the Elizabethan, worldview was, kind of everything has to be in balance, and you can't have too much of any one of the humors, and you can't have too much.
Right.
And so this one is just the need for this. These guys take this complete leap in the first scene, and it has to be brought back into some kind of balance. I made a note when I was listening to it about because they make a contract at the end. They're writing a contract in the first scene, and then the women kind of make them make contracts at the end, individual contracts.
Right.
And so the difference, what's the difference? And that was one of the questions that came up when I was watching the cast talk, is someone asked them, what's the difference between the contract that the men are engaging in at the beginning and the contract that they're engaging in at the end, where they're saying a year of going without, a year of in the monastery, or a year. I love that Barone is a year entertaining in a hospital. It's like the best. You've got to go be with really sick and dying people and make your jokes and see how many of them fly. I just adore that.
Yeah.
I'm glad Shakespeare came up with it.
Go and help some people who actually need help.
Right.
Right.
Get a little perspective.
Right.
It's all about the women kind of giving them perspective. And throughout the play, there's so many lines about seeing and the eyes and observing. And it's like these guys have walled themselves up in really basic, literally an ivory tower.
Right.
And the women come, they're not allowed in, but they're there to make the men like see, to knock down their walls. And go, you got to see that there's a world out here, and it's not, you can't wall it out, and you can't say that you know things about the world if you're not even looking out at the world.
And interestingly, they are ultimately the smartest people in the play.
Oh, absolutely.
Of course, they will be never recognized as the scholars or potential scholars by the intellectual elite that we're seeing here.
Right.
But they have just, and I think this is part of the point of the play too. There's a passage that suggests this to some degree, that, okay, they may not be educated or maybe not even as smart as these men, but they have this natural, intuitive understanding of how the world works. And therefore they can just wrap the men around their finger very easily. And they say wisdom that's actually wisdom. It's not rationality that goes to an insane degree. So
and again, it's the balance. It's like you've got to have the things that the men desire are not necessarily bad things, but they're trying to shut out food and sleep and the joy of a relationship.
And they're trying to cut out women. I mean, that women is the other side of the male-female balance. So they're also being imbalanced by segregating themselves away from women. Thinking that we can make a men's world and it will be the superior world. So you gotta have the balance.
And I love that it's the women, the female characters, that really get to come in, and Shakespeare lets them say, here's the balance. The balance is, and it's one of those things where we kind of understand it on an intuitive level, that women kind of get more of the earthy. Some of the scenes with the women were a little earthier.
But just their immediate understanding of how human nature is interacting. It seems like the men are almost like puppets standing up and saying, me, 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 and me, 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 me. And then the women just kind of flow around and understand how all these things are happening, while the rest of them are saying, look at me over here, look at me over here. They understand how it's all working together, and therefore they have an advantage in the
Right.
field, essentially. So,
Yeah, yeah. Men have a tendency, especially in British culture,
mhm.
to define themselves by who they were taught by, right?
Right. Mhm.
By their mentor.
Their tutors.
And
Yeah.
so
That's a good
your
point.
mentor, your tutor, whoever. And so your default position when you become uncomfortable is to recite what you were taught, right?
Mhm.
Because that shows, I went to Harvard Law, so this is what I learned. So that means I know what I'm talking about.
Right.
When the truth is they have no idea, And the thing is that we talk about the fact that women weren't respected or weren't expected to be educated in the same way.
Mhm.
But part of that is also freeing for the women as
Right.
far as making those connections and having the freedom to have freer thought,
Right.
right?
Right.
And
Exactly.
be able to make connections that the men can't make because they were never allowed, right?
Right.
If
And
you
ironically,
went off if you went off the line, if you started talking off the line, then you're not in school anymore, right? You're
Right.
not, your career's over,
Mhm.
and you're not allowed to make some of those different kind of connections that women were and are better at than men, right?
And I think he makes the same argument for the highbrows and the common people.
Right. Well, I think what unites them to me, because I think another thing, I think this is always in Shakespeare's place too, is the effect of human pride on anything, and they have that in equal abundance here.
Yeah.
Pride makes both of those parties, the low and the high, be just clowns, essentially. So, and that's another advantage the women have. There's being these second class citizens in the society, they're able to just see past that. They're not observing with the intent of using the situation to build themselves up in some
Yeah.
way. They're not colored by that idea.
Yeah.
Well,
I think I love the princess's speech when she's got the bow pulled and she's looking
Mhm.
at the deer and she's saying, if I shoot to kill, that is better than if I shoot to wound. If I shoot to wound, it's for pride.
Mhm.
It's just a very interesting,
Mhm.
you have to go back, and I had to go back and watch it a couple times. And I was like, okay, I'm kind of getting the thought process here, but it's a philosophical question. She's just standing there with a bow and thinking about shooting the deer, but having this whole philosophical debate about, why am I doing this? And if I shoot to kill and prove that I'm like a crack shot, that's pride. If I shoot to wound to prove that I don't have to,
Mhm.
it was.
Yeah, she's almost overthinking pride and humility, interestingly, which makes some sense when you think about it, because that would have been the education for women,
Sure.
how to be the demure lady.
Uh-huh. Yeah. It was a really nice bit. I love that at the end, she really has to go home and rule her kingdom,
Mhm.
and is suddenly an equal to the king, because
Mhm.
now she's going to be a queen, and there's a lot there. Just
there is, yeah, and I think there was more in the language than there was in the performance that we saw, the Stratford performance. I just think there's a lot there that you could do with her and her realizing that and she completely takes charge. As soon as she finds out that her father is dead, she is in charge. And that could have been stronger, I think, in that performance.
Yeah.
Because she has been prepared and is prepared for it. And Britain has a queen. They don't have a king. They have a queen that never took a king, right?
Mhm.
Never took a husband
Mhm.
as king. And that informs it as well.
Mhm.
That there is while we have this idea of the Elizabethan woman as demure, they also had a ruler who was a woman,
Mhm.
and who was seen as desirable and powerful and frightening, right?
And they say, I guess Shakespeare wouldn't have been aware of it because not enough history would have passed, but they say all the best, the most prosperous eras in British history are always under a queen, not under a king. So I guess Britain is in bad shape right now because now they have 3 maids lined up. We'll see.
But
They just need some more women prime ministers.
Yeah.
To be fine.
So what's interesting
That would be a good balance. What's that?
I think I read that they performed this play for the Queen, and
Yeah,
so
right.
that would
It
make
was originally.
yeah, so
first-
that would make
first
sense why we
performance.
have these strong, you know, the female
That's true.
characters. Are
That's a
the
good
smart
point.
ones.
Yeah.
The Queen, you know,
Yeah.
he's flattering her by giving
Yeah.
the
Women
Queen
being
in the play the intelligence and the
That's a
wherewithal
good point. Yeah.
to, you know, ferret out the guy's schemes and to call them out on it really is what they do. That was kind of backtracking a little bit. One of the parts that I really enjoyed is when Rosaline told her guy, Barone,
yeah.
I'm the worst at names. Anyways, Barone, that I didn't believe you when you said you loved me because you're just always making jokes.
Right.
I didn't believe you. And just kind of calls them out on that. Like, be honest, be who you are. And I thought that was really, really a neat
But
moment.
he's been making jokes for so long, he doesn't know who he is, which is why he needs to go make jokes in a hospital.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so apt, you know, these women have observed these guys. They know who they are. They know what they need in order to be mature enough to be a good match.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of it. And you know, Shakespeare loves to set things in France and Italy, and you know, and because then he can make a lot more fun of the court. If he was setting it in England, he couldn't make some of the jokes he makes about court, right? But everybody can see it and translate as much of it as they want, you know. And I think it's interesting that in this play, it's set in France, but the Spaniard's really the only like wacky character, you know, with the wacky accent and all of that kind of stuff. And he does that to French people in other plays, but this one, he makes the court, you know, the people, the main characters all very recognizable, and with their excesses, which we can say, oh well, they're French, right? So that's okay. But at the same time, can tie them then a little more closely to the world that he's more involved in. I think that's brilliant, and I think writers are generally brilliant at that, at knowing, you know, the really great writers are the ones who know right where that edge is, where no, this puts me in jail and this gets me, you know, an assassin squad, and this is really, you know,
And
right on the edge of that is where I want to be.
This will make
know.
the Queen laugh,
Yeah,
but she won't realize that maybe there's a little subversion going on.
yeah.
Yeah,
Or she might realize it, but let it pass.
but let it pass.
She'll let this pass. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that about great writers of all times. They know where the line is, or they find the line. Sometimes the Russian ones had a little trouble. Spent a lot of time in jail.
Maybe there's different cultural lines. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and you know, when the guy in charge mad, it makes it harder. But yeah.
So one of the things that I studied in my class this last spring, I talk a lot about it because that was my, you know, that's my most recent experience with Shakespeare, is how the names of the characters have meanings too. And so I did not go too far into that with this. I don't know if you all have any insight in that, but the Dull character was really interesting to me. I loved his line where he said, I have no idea what you just said. Because I felt like that's me. I have no idea what this guy just said. There's too much Latin. I don't know what's going on. Like, I guess that makes me the dull guy. But sometimes the dull guy was the one who actually had more wisdom than the crazy wise guy. And then the costard, yeah, that means head.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So
Well, I think that's like I was saying, these people want to be all head and no body.
Mhm.
Want to somehow
There you
divorce
go,
the two.
yeah. And then they milk that joke to death with how
Mhm.
can a head have a
Right.
bruise on his shin?
Because
It goes
there's
on for
the head, there's the head that thinks, there's the head that's the leader, there's so many heads. And then,
yeah,
I don't know, was their head, was the toilet back then? I guess not.
I don't think so, but yeah.
Just adds on more layers of meaning as we go through history.
Well, there
Yeah,
was one, I was wondering if it was the same joke back then where he calls the person a dick. I was wondering if it meant the same thing back then. Because I think dick meant just a guy, a person back then. But now it means something else.
Yeah.
I was wondering if it's the same
I
translation.
think it had the same double meaning it
did?
does
Okay.
now. In
That
Britain
word is
anyway.
that old?
I think it's pretty much that
Wow.
old, yeah. Yeah, because the British people I know, that's an old way of expressing, yeah. I would guess that is that dates back
That
to
dates
that
back
time,
that
but I haven't
far.
done the research.
I have to say too, one of the thoughts that I had was at the beginning, Nicole, your introduction, you talked about how these guys want fame. It's about their pride. They're taking this oath so that they can, live on in, story and song and be legends, right? Kind of legends in their own mind. Really interesting that Shakespeare juxtaposes that with the pageant of the nine worthies, where the simple characters are like, this is how we see Pompey and Caesar and Alexander and Judas Maccabees. And the men just make fun of that. The men are really rude at their performance. The king and his men are just, mocking them. And it's like, there's a paradox, there's a lovely twist there with Shakespeare saying, when you're alive and you're like, I'm going to do this for posterity and my name is going to live after, you don't know how you're going to be depicted after you're gone.
Right.
And you're probably going to be the subject of a play by kind of a half-rate playwright. And people are going to laugh at you. Just like Shakespeare did with all his history plays. And I think he was making, it was like a little joke on himself and his line of work.
Yeah.
But it was also just saying, here's these guys and they've got this great idea about how they're going to be seen after they're dead. And they're going to write fame on our tombstones. And then these guys come in to do this play about notable people, the people that the common people think are really important. And it's just silly.
Right.
And the men just mock at them.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think it's like, that's a really interesting insight into how Shakespeare kind of saw. And that whole fifth act is just this sort of approaching, very subtly, you see the approaching shadow of death kind of coming.
Right. And what Carla was just saying just goes back to what you were saying, Nicole, about pride, about the themes of pride and humility, right? In the show, because I can try to leave a mark, right? I want to have the Nobel Peace Prize. Doesn't mean people are going to remember me well,
No.
There's nothing I can do about that.
And chasing it rarely leads to anything great.
And very subtly, like one of the last people to leave the stage is the pregnant woman, because that's where the future is coming from.
Exactly.
It's not living on these guys' tombstones.
That's true legacy.
Exactly. And you can only get it through the female.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
Which Brown has a line in the middle of the play where he says, we wouldn't be men if it weren't for the women who bore us, basically. And so he does have that recognition that
is a very uncomfortable point for a misogynist, actually.
Yeah. But Shakespeare puts it in his mouth, and
actually, I didn't mention that theory, but that is one theory. Woman be as the source of misogyny. The fact that men just don't have that same control over life, you know, that ability to produce life.
Yep.
What else?
Well, I'm just like jotting down things that I remember from my class, and that, you know, the talking about the worthies, that's a play within a play, and Shakespeare uses that technique many times in his plays.
Yes.
We'll see it next week when we talk about Hamlet. It was in, is it Midsummer Night's Dream? You know, all
I
of
think most of them have it, actually.
yeah, and it's
Yeah,
really an
most
important aspect of his plays, and I think you guys have really caught that and really expressed that well, that we can see a lot of his purpose in that play within a play. That play about the worthies kinds of highlights for us what he's trying to get across.
I think always that there's presented in those plays within a play that everything is like acting in the human world. I think that's why he did it so often, that we're all just kind of making it up and and playing out a pretend story for the sake of others, you know. So I think that's always part of the point. I mean, because these scholars, they're pretending to be scholars in a sense by putting on the airs of a scholar, right? And to a certain degree, all of the characters, perhaps with the exception of the female characters, have a lot of artifice about them. You know, they're almost pretenders to whatever they're doing, and it's more about puffing themselves up to look the part of whatever they're doing, right? But I think that's part of the message always with the play within a play. But and of course, you have to turn that around then. And I also mentioned in my little intro thing the fact that a character does turn to the audience, so the audience becomes a participant in the play itself, you know, because he's talking to you. You then become a character in the play as well. So that's going on as well. So it's kind of an interesting play with the other meaning of the word play.
He really loves to play with the idea of the world as a stage,
right?
And masks.
Right.
People
always putting on masks, right?
And playing characters, or not being recognized just because they have something over their face.
Right.
I did like the way that the actors played with the king and the princess both wore glasses. And had a hard time actually seeing each other until they were right face to face. And it was vanity that made them take off their glasses when they met someone of the opposite sex, and then they really see them clearly. And they played a lot with that, which was really fun. And the princess wore her glasses when she was alone with her ladies, and he wore his glasses when he was alone with his men. But when they showed up, and I think that they just, you know, it was a little added prop thing, but it's very much in the text that they want to see each other with that like misty myopic view, partly because they're too vain to show themselves as needing the glasses. And just, it's an interesting, and on some level that's kind of what they're saying that love does to us, is it gives us this kind of single vision where we're not really seeing everything clearly. And at the end, it's kind of like we need to put our spectacles on, or take our rose-colored spectacles off, or whatever your metaphor is, and see each other for who we are.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I really enjoyed this one. Last week we talked about Timon, and that one was kind of depressing. So it was kind of nice to have a not depressing play to talk about. There was a lot of humor in this one, and even though at the end we don't see the typical couples getting married and things like that, we still see this kind of hopefulness. We have this idea that in a year after the Queen's mourning time is over, after the guys accomplish their tasks, that they will be together. And so we have kind of this meaningful ending that I really enjoyed this time. I liked the happy ending rather than this terrible ending.
The stage littered with bodies.
Yes. Yeah, which we'll see next week, I guess. But
yeah, that one ends that way. But yeah, I mean,
Want
when
to take this one?
Mhm. No.
We did the version,
will do.
the version that we saw by the Royal Shakespeare Company was really interesting in that there's a lot of debate about, there is on the books a play called Love's Labour's Won, and whether it's a lost manuscript or whether it was a working title for another one of Shakespeare's plays. There's a lot of scholarly debate about that. And when we saw the Royal Shakespeare Company do this in tandem with Much Ado, there's a huge number of similarities between the characters in this play and Beatrice and Benedick and some of the characters in Much Ado. And what they chose to do was really lovely. The set was the same for both shows, and it was based on an actual English manor house. The time period for Love's Labour's Lost was 1914, and the time period for Much Ado was 1918. And so World War One, happened in between the two plays. And at the end of Love's Labour's Lost, when the princess found out her father was dead, the men walked off stage and they came back in khaki to go into the trenches. And they sang the song, and you were laughing one minute at the Nine Worthies and all the fun stuff they were doing, and then just tears because these boys were in khaki and they were marching off to go to the fields of France. And so, yes, there was like a hopeful note, but it was really, and especially Barone, when Rosalind is saying, you're going to have to go to a hospital and you're going to, it was like heart-wrenching. And it was this beautiful, it's a comedy right up until it's isn't. Not. And that was a really, I couldn't wait to see how they played the end of the Stratford version, because I was like, the end of that one really impacted me. And I was like, I wonder how they're going to handle the end. And I liked it, but I have to say the version that I saw with them going off to the war was, that like hit me really hard and was really beautiful. And then when they did Much Ado, it was an army, the house had been turned into an army field hospital. So there were cots in the room that had been the intellectuals' study in the first play. It was an army hospital.
Basically a hospital, yeah.
And so it was like, and now it's over and we've all learned something, and the people in Much Ado seem a little more connected to their world than this.
Because they're coming back from war.
Yeah. So it was a very interesting, and it was like, I buy that the two were meant as bookends. They made a good case.
That is interesting how the staging choices can make such a difference in interpretation of a play.
Yeah.
It's really amazing.
Yeah. Time period.
Because that certainly, that probably wasn't an intention of Shakespeare, but it clearly deepened it to have that element.
Yeah. It's great to teach Shakespeare and to do Shakespeare and to say, what time period does this speak to? And it speaks to so many, because he was really just a student of human nature, and human nature hasn't changed all that much.
Honestly, that is, in my opinion, that is the greatness of Shakespeare, and why he doesn't.
That's why I laugh.
Disappear.
Yeah.
Because it's so accurate to human nature that it is relevant to any generation. So.
Right, and specifically this one, the language might get in the way a little bit. But
that's why I'm saying to really get it, you have to read it, I think, with those footnotes.
Yeah, and see, that's one point I would disagree with you on, Nicole, because I think in order to really get it, you have to perform it.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you though too.
Yeah.
But I think there is so much lost in the modern era because you just simply don't know what the
Right, it's lost to the modern
words
ear.
mean
Yeah.
if you,
And so
unless you
the
have
performance
that
has to take those timeless those timeless elements and project them onto the stage so that the people get it in spite of not understanding all of
Right.
the subtleties of the language. That's
Well,
the
that's where great
power of the performance.
Shakespearean actors are really wonderful. You sometimes can
Yeah,
get the
and that
meaning of an unusual word just by a gesture. You know,
Mhm.
that gesture can help you get the context of it.
I think that's why it's so important that we can see these. That's why when we're having these conversations right now, because, you know, my son is just finished his freshman year in high school. And at the end of the year, when the school shut down, they were studying Romeo and Juliet. So here he's trying to study this play with no context, no classroom, just like, here, read this and answer these questions. And he's completely lost. And so being able to see it and read it at the same time, we are better at interpreting those visual cues sometimes than reading that old
Yeah,
language. And so especially for our students and for younger folks to be able to watch it, I mean, I was able to get more out of watching it without having to read it several times and kind of figure things out and look up words and, you know, all the things that we tell people to do when you're reading literature.
Well, plays ultimately are meant to be performed and seen. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You're not experiencing it in the way it's meant to be experienced unless you
right. It's the
unless you watch
medium.
it.
And
Right.
we were just approached, somebody just approached us to ask if they could film our upcoming Shakespeare that we're doing at the end of the summer. And our answer is kind of like, no, because the medium of live theater is live theater, not video or film,
Doesn't translate.
right? It doesn't like, how many good videotapes of stage productions have you actually seen?
The Stratford is doing a great job.
This was a great,
but it was
absolutely
produced for video.
Right.
But when you see it, you know that the audience was getting nuances and things that you didn't get on their video, which is one of the things that I really love to do with live theater is say, you know, just because you're a background character and you don't have lines to say, you're still acting the whole time. And if one person is watching you instead of watching the main character, you're still telling the story. And that's what makes it really magical in the room. And cameras can't always capture that. They captured a wonderful representation of what the Stratford did. But live theater is like what's happening in the room, and the audience is another character, like Nicole said before. The audience is a whole person that Shakespeare was really kind enough to include in his dialogue. So many times in Shakespeare, the characters talk directly to the audience, share their innermost thoughts with the audience. Say, glad you were here at the end, and you go your way and we'll go ours, which was a brilliant last line for this one.
Yes.
What's interesting too, something just a last kind of thought, is that in my class, we learned that Shakespeare didn't originally write the plays down. They were written down after the performance because most of the actors wouldn't have been able to read anyways.
And in fact, there's differing versions because they had often more than one person writing them down. So they got little details wrong on one or the other, and we don't know which one is right.
Right. There's so many versions. So I think that's something that was really interesting to me to learn that, because like you said, Lane, Shakespeare made a living by his plays, but he didn't like think of himself as writing this play to live on for centuries. He was writing it for his audience right now. And yet here we are benefiting from his views of human nature hundreds of years later, which is a really cool.
It's kind of funny to think that he's talking about the vanity of chasing after fame and how stupid that is, but he's probably the person that has achieved the longest fame of just about anyone on the planet. It's really amazing to think, isn't it, that here these plays are so old, but somewhere on the planet, almost all of his plays are being produced somewhere. I mean, there's not even a living playwright that can say that.
Right.
It's quite amazing.
It is amazing. Well, you guys, it's 7:31, so we are done with our hour. That went by very quickly. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I really enjoyed having you guys, Carla and Lane, and Nicole. You did such a great job on that intro. It really helped, I think, set the stage for the reading.
Set the stage for the stage.
Watching. Yes, you did. So it was great. So next week we'll be discussing Hamlet. So I hope that our viewers will come back and watch Hamlet with us and discuss it next week.
Thank you. Thank you for
All right,
organizing
guys,
this.
have a great week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.